While traveling through the southern United States, it's hard to miss seeing the lush green vines that sprawl throughout fields, drape luxuriously over trees and fences, and even over abandoned buildings. Pereira lobata, more commonly known as kudzu, originated in Japan, Asia. It was introduced to the United States in 1876 by the Japanese during a garden exhibition. The plant is edible, but often sprayed with herbicides. Kudzu's environmental and ecological damage results from acting through interference competition, meaning it outcompetes other species for a resource. The plant climbs over trees or shrubs and grows so rapidly that it kills them by heavy shading. There are now over 2 million acres of kudzu across the South. Kudzu vine isn't all bad news. It does have some redeeming qualities. As mentioned earlier, it is used as a tasty treat. But the plant also controls erosion. The rubbery vines can even be used for basket weaving. Even then, not everybody wants kudzu around. So how can we get rid of this invasive plant? We can learn to keep it in control, but we may never completely get rid of it. Mechanical means of controlling kudzu are more effective than herbicides, but they may be more time-consuming. Kudzu can be kept in control if goats or cattle are allowed to graze on it. Constant grazing will eventually weaken the plants. We may have to learn to live with kudzu, but make sure to keep the windows closed at night so the vines don't come in the house. The species Pereira lobata belongs to the genus Pereira, a type of woody pine. It is of the family Fabaceae, meaning legumes and peas, of the class Dicotyledonei, having 2 cotyledons in their seeds. It is in the division angiosperms, meaning flowery plants. You may or may not have known that plants have a vascular system to transport nutrients. Plants also have seeds for reproduction. For the clade angiosperms, there is one noticeable characteristic that separates it from its sister group, gymnosperms. Plants start out with 2 categories: flowering plants, known as the angiosperms, and non-flowering plants, known as the gymnosperms. Gymnosperms have naked seeds. This means that they have no fruit surrounding the seed. The seeds are often in a cone. Today we will focus on the flowering plants, angiosperms, specifically dicots. Angiosperms display a huge variety of life forms, including trees, herbs, submerged aquatics, bulbs, and epiphytes. Angiosperms are found in almost every habitat. There are over 352 species and over 400 families. Angiosperms reproduce sexually and asexually. But before we go into fertilization of a flowering plant, we will cover the floral organ. The sepals make the outermost wall to protect the flower during the bud stage. Petals are usually brightly colored to attract insects and other pollinators. The male reproductive organs include the anther and filament, which make up the stamen. The stigma, style, and ovary make the female parts known as the pistil. In the ovary are the ovules. In the ovule is an embryo sac, and in the embryo sac is an egg. The life cycle of plants consists of alternations of haploid and diploid generations, which essentially take turns producing one another. Pollen grains are produced in the stamen, the male reproductive parts. The anthers contain the pollen sacs, which contain the diploid cells called microsporocytes. Each microsporocyte divides by meiosis, producing 4 haploid microspores, each of which develop into a pollen grain. When the pollen grain lands on the stigma, a pollen tube begins to grow. As the pollen tube grows, the male gametophyte in the pollen grains matures and its nucleus divides, forming 2 sperm. The pollen group grows through the style and into the ovary, where it releases the sperm cells. Female gametophyte or embryo sac development occurs within the ovule. Development occurs when the megasporocyte, the mother cell, enlarges and undergoes meiosis, producing 4 haploid megaspores. However, only one megaspore survives, the others degenerate. This nucleus divides by mitosis 3 times without cytokinesis, resulting in one large cell with 8 haploid cells. At the end of the embryo sac are 2 synergid cells which border the egg. These cells help attract and guide the pollen tube to the embryo sac. Double fertilization is the union of 2 sperm cells within different nuclei of the female gametophyte. This is when the pollen tube discharges 2 sperm cells into the female gametophyte. One sperm cell fertilizes the egg, forming the zygote. The other sperm combines with the two polar nuclei of the embryo sac's large central cell, forming a triploid cell that develops into a nutritive tissue called endosperm. After fertilization, the zygote divides several times, producing the diploid cell. The ovule develops a tough coat, which gradually develops into a seed. Some angiosperms can self-pollinate, but such species are limited to interbreeding in nature. Most angiosperms rely on pollination, the transfer of pollen from one anther to the stigma. Approximately 80% of pollination among angiosperms rely on biotic living pollinating animals. Other means of pollen transfer rely on wind and water. Angiosperms can further be divided into two main groups, monocots and dicots. Monocots have one cotyledon in their seeds, while dicots have two cotyledons in their seeds. Dicots have petals in multiples of 4 or 5. Their leaf veins are more complicated and have more connections than monocots, sort of like a net. Dicots can produce wood. Examples of dicots include magnolias, oaks, beeches, willows, maples, asters, zinnias, marigolds, cacti, jade plant, tomatoes and potatoes, poison ivy, cotton, blueberries, and of course, kudzu.
Flowering plants, I'm talking about the angiosperms, which are any plants with flowers. And those are different from the gymnosperms, like pine trees, the mosses, the ferns, and all of the other primitive plants.
Every one of these flowering plants we got can be divided into one of two categories, either a monocot or a dicot.
So here's the backstory. For flowering plants, biologists had finally divided them up into two groups, the monocots and dicots, the members of which tended to share similar features. So here are the features we most commonly use. Monocots like this lily are usually in multiples of 3.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Dicots have petals generally in multiples of 4 or 5.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Monocots typically have parallel veins, while dicots are net veined. If you pull up a monocot, most of the time it'll have these fibrous, spreading, or they call them adventitious roots. While the taproot, that's classic dicot. Stems. Cut the stem of a monocot in cross-section, and you'll see something like this. Vascular bundles scattered all around. While in dicots, they're usually at the edge. Cotyledons. This refers to parts in the seed. Monocots, also known as monocotyledons, means one cotyledon in the seed. And dicots, like this bean, have 2.